Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today we want to talk about natural selection, and a lot of times you'll hear survival of the fittest and natural selection. I like to call it, and lots of other people do too, survival of the fit enough. Now, before we continue, let's just review, and here's your first question. Um, if it will come up, there it is. Let's just review what evolution is, okay? And so here are your choices: that it's a change in traits over time, a change in phenotypes over time, a change in genotypes over time, or a change in allele frequency over time. Well, if you recall from our conversations earlier, when we were talking about mutations, that evolution is actually, and I said we'd talk about this later, well, now is later. Evolution is defined as the change in allele frequency over time. And so what that means is that you actually have a shift in the number of allele types, right? And I don't mean like if you had two, you have one, although that happens sometimes. I mean like if you start out and let's just take it simple. Your recessive allele is 50%. Your dominant allele is 50%. So let's say that there's some pressure, and so the recessive allele is not as fit. And so eventually that will push towards the dominant allele because the ones who have the recessive allele, right, and probably they are homozygous recessive, these are the ones that are not as successful, and so they're not reproducing as often, and we'll talk about that in just a second. So it's that change in allele frequency. Traits and phenotypes, that's the same thing, right, because we've talked about that before. The phenotype is the expression of the genotype. You know, those things, that may just be individual variety. It doesn't mean that evolution is occurring. Evolution has to be this shift, okay, towards some difference in the actual alleles. And genotypes can change from generation to generation, because remember, if you have two alleles, you have three possible genotypes. Well, in any individual, remember, you have all of this nice one chromosome comes from the mother, and one chromosome comes from the father in each of those pairs, right? And so it's kind of random as to which one you get. And so you can have this just random redistribution of the alleles, but the percentage of the actual alleles themselves could be the same, even though the genotypes are changing, right? Because of that difference in the jumblies. So, or the jumbly up of that. That is not a real word, by the way. So anyway, so the answer to this is the change in allele frequency over time. We're going to talk about this more, but before we do, let's talk about the people who actually came up with the idea of natural selection. Now, evolution, the idea of evolution, of small changes, gradual changes over long periods of time, had actually been around for a while, but it is Charles Darwin who is one of two men who come up with the idea of natural selection as the mechanism that drives those small changes. Charles Darwin was a naturalist. He traveled on this 5-year scientific expedition to South America, and the fun fact, the ship was called the HMS Beagle. He actually made several really important observations in the Galapagos, which are the really famous Galapagos finches, and then in the mountains, right? And he found fossils, sea creatures, right? Fossils of sea creatures high in the mountains. And so he had recently read Principles of Geography by Charles Lyell that actually talked about basically the ideas that would lead to the modern theory of plate tectonics, that you have these changes in the plates, they're moving, and so what was once at the bottom of the sea could eventually end up at the top of a mountain. And so Darwin started thinking about that in terms of the species that would inhabit those places, and he noticed as he was traveling to all of these different areas that there was a wide variety of habitats and organisms, and that organisms filled their own niches. And the idea of the niche was also not new, right? But he started looking at the distribution of animals and what they were doing, how they were they unique to that area, things like that. And he found out that certain animals were unique to certain habitats, and specifically islands, which is what he was looking at, the Galapagos Islands. Also, fun fact, he only spent 5 weeks there. But anyway, so Darwin's finches are these radically different looking birds because they've each adapted to the different islands, and each island actually supported its own population of finches that were unique. And so he started to reason that there must be something that changes those organisms, right? Those individuals, and overall those populations. So, and we'll talk about individuals versus populations later on, okay? Now, the other thing that he noticed, and this was influenced by his reading of Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population, that talked about the idea that population growth is exponential, but resources are limited, okay? And we'll come back to that in just a second too, all right? But organisms have large numbers of offspring, but populations pretty much remain constant, population numbers, okay? Now, another man that was working on this at the same time, and eventually they actually got together and worked together, although Charles Darwin's work ended up overshadowing Alfred Russel Wallace's work. Alfred Russel Wallace is as important to the modern theory of evolution as Darwin was. And he was a naturalist and a geographer who traveled to the Amazon basin. So both of them, interestingly enough, are doing work in South America. And he also went to the Malay archipelago. And he was exploring and collecting species in both of these places. And he was noticing very much the same kinds of things. And his contributions that were unique was the idea that geography, because he's a biogeographer, geography really affects the ranges of species. It can limit it, it can facilitate the spread of species. And as he was looking at organisms, he noticed that there was a line that split Indonesia and the Indonesian species into two groups. The ones that were closer to, the side that was closer to Asia were actually closer related to Asian species. But immediately on the other side of that line, on those islands on the other side of the line, those animals were more closely related to Australia, right? Australian species. And so what that means is that those islands met, right, sometime after those species had traveled to those islands from these mainland areas. And that also is supported by Charles Lyell's work. And they're all contemporary, and so they're actually all talking about this together, which I think is really cool. So anyway, this dividing line, by the way, is called Wallace's line, and it actually is a huge support of the idea that continents drift over time. He also hypothesized that natural selection would lead to speciation because there would be this idea that as animals became more, or plants, organisms, whatever, became more adapted or better adapted, they would start to diverge, right? Their phenotypes, their character, whatever you want to call it, would all start to diverge, behaviors perhaps. And if you had hybrids, that those hybrids would not be as well adapted as either of the parents. And so natural selection would actually tend to favor things that prevented hybrids from being born. And we know that the definition of a species is, and this is loose, but it's what we're accepting, the idea of organisms who interbreed in the wild, okay? And so you would have the favoring of mechanisms that prevented hybridization between these different species, well, these different types of populations, because those hybrids would not be as fit, okay? And we'll talk about this more as we start doing labs and activities and things. Okay, so now we want to start talking about natural selection. And really, what is it? Natural selection is the mechanism of change. It's the thing that is changing these allele frequencies. Now, how does it work? First of all, we're going to talk about some of the things we just talked about a second ago. There are more offspring that are born than can survive, okay? And resources are limited, and so this leads to competition among those offspring. The ones who are most successful will survive. The ones who are not, don't. Traits that enhance survival are going to lead to more successful individuals. That's what we're talking about. These traits are actually called adaptive traits, and some of these traits are heritable. That means that those traits will be passed to the offspring, and more successful individuals will pass on their genes more frequently, and this is called differential reproduction. Now, here's your next question. In every population, there is variation. It is important that this variation involves a variety of colors, is heritable, is beneficial, is acquired during an organism's lifetime. Well, involving a variety of colors, variation sometimes does, but that's not really that important. It's just a type of variation, so that's definitely not the answer. It does have to be heritable. If it is not heritable, it is not passed on to the next generation, and it dies with the individual when that individual's lifetime is or lifespan is over. Okay, and so it's got to be passed on from generation to generation. It does not have to be beneficial. Okay, it does not have to be beneficial. Lots of things actually aren't beneficial, and those organisms get weeded out, right, if you will. Is acquired during an organism's lifetime. If you acquire something during your lifetime, it is not heritable, okay, unless it's some sort of mutation, something like that. And it's in the germ cells. If it's in a somatic cell, like skin cancer, for instance, that is not going to be heritable, okay? It's got to be in the germ cells, the eggs and the sperm, and it's got to be genetic. It's got to be encoded in the genes. And so if you practice a sport or a musical instrument or something like that and you get really good at it, your child is not going to be born really good, okay, at that, unless they happen to have a natural gift for it, which they may or may not. But your hard work will not translate into their success in that respect, okay? And when we talk about the acquiring of traits, right, we're talking about something called Lamarckism. And there was a man named Lamarck who suggested that the giraffe, for instance, right, the giraffe is the big textbook thing, has a really long neck. Darwin would say that over generations, giraffes that had slightly longer necks would be able to reach higher branches and they would be more successful, okay? And that is the way, right? That's natural selection. Lamarck would have said that the giraffes would have stretched their necks and stretched their necks and stretched their necks. And so as they stretched their necks, the babies were born with longer necks. And then they stretched their necks and their babies were born with longer necks. You can see why that is crazy talk, right? That sounds, I'm sure it made sense at the time when people didn't know really a whole lot about this. But the idea is that is crazy, right? Let's just say that. That is not true. Acquired traits, things you learn, things you practice, right? The loss of a finger, right? Any of those things, not going to be passed on. It's got to be in the genes. That's the bottom line, okay? And speaking of bottom lines, let's talk about the really important points. I'm going to say again, natural selection can only work on heritable traits. You have to understand this, okay? Selection does not always lead to evolution. Just because you're having something selected for or against doesn't mean it actually changes the allele frequency over time. Evolution is occurring when the allele frequency changes. Selection doesn't always do that. Populations evolve. An individual cannot evolve because its genetic code is not changing. Its alleles are not changing. It's the number of alleles in an entire population from one generation to the next. Populations can evolve, individuals cannot. Okay? Environmental pressures are not constant, right? What's working today may not work tomorrow if the environment is different. Climates change, resources change, animals move in, move out, go extinct, new traits arise, and that can affect everybody else. So environmental pressures are dynamic. They change. It's not constant, okay? And so there's this idea of never being perfectly adapted, okay? Now, mutations and crossing over, those are random. Natural selection is not random. There is a direction in which these pressures will push organisms, okay? Mutations, crossing over, totally random. You get something, it either works or it doesn't. Natural selection will decide if it works or it doesn't, okay? Random versus not random. Very important that you understand these 5 things, okay? All right. Now, there's some other mechanisms that can change allele frequencies other than natural selection. And when we start talking about changing allele frequencies, we're talking about something called a genetic disequilibrium, okay? Now, obviously, the one that we've talked about a lot, right, is mutation, and this brings in new genetic material. So we're going to move on from that because we've talked about it a lot. Now, genetic drift is something else. When you have very small populations, you're very likely to have radical changes in the alleles because some individuals may or may not breed, right? They may or may not have offspring. And so over time, alleles can actually be randomly lost, and so the frequencies will drift. And so here's an example. We have these cute little bunnies. So let's say that all of these little bunnies have babies, these 5, and they reproduce, and they have all of these guys, right? But for whatever reason, in this generation, we've got this really small population, only these two rabbits reproduce. Well, they're both homozygous dominant. You're going to lose white rabbits forever, right? You're going to lose them forever unless something else happens, some new mutation or whatever, because now you've only got the dominant allele. And so all of the rabbits from now on will always have the dominant allele for this gene because we've lost the recessive allele, okay? And that is genetic drift. It's totally random. It does not happen in large populations typically, okay? There are some exceptions to that, but most of the time it does not happen in large populations. Small populations more likely. Okay, so the thing about this is it reduces genetic variation, okay? And that can cause problems, but sometimes genetic drift can occur because of events, okay? Sometimes it's just like in this scenario where you have the female cheetah is going to mate with multiple males. She has cubs from different males, okay? In this case, she's mated with only one male, and so all the cubs have the same father. High variety, different fathers. Low variety, same father, okay? So there's that. But outside events can change this too, and one of them that we're going to talk about two. The first one is the bottleneck effect, and both of these are examples of genetic drift because you've got a certain number of individuals that are reproducing that are not representative of the entire population, okay? So in this case, and this is actually a real example, by the way, the seals. Hunting of seals in the late 1800s actually really reduced population size. And so it reduced it by so much. Many alleles were actually lost because of the very tiny surviving population. And so it's called a bottleneck because all of the rest of these guys never get out to reproduce, and only some of them actually do that. And so only their genes are passed on. All of these genes from the other seals, gone. They're all gone. Okay. Now, a similar thing is called the founder effect. In bottleneck, something happens to reduce the population overall, okay? In the founder effect, a small population migrates and becomes isolated from the rest of the population. This, by the way, is what explains the Galapagos finch differences. Islands, you get small populations moving to the islands. They are now isolated, and so changes that occur in those populations, those will happen in those populations, and they're not representative of the original population. Okay, so in this little guy, you've got all these little ladybugs. Some of them are green, but the new population that migrates, they're all red. You won't have any green ones here because those are lost to this population. Okay, another really good example, and since it's human evolution, we're going to use people, are going to be the Amish. The Amish have a tendency to have Ellis van Creveld disease, and it's a genetic disorder, and because they are a very small population that migrated over and they tend to interbreed within their population, you have some characteristics that occur in these individuals. And I just want to talk about two of them, the polydactyly, right? And so you have multiple fingers, and this is going to happen on both hands, both toes. Typically you'll have shorter fingers, and then there's some other things that happen. There's some teeth things and all kinds of stuff, but I just wanted to show you that this is something that's going to persist in that population because it's a very small gene pool. Okay. Now, there are some things that are not random. Non-random mating. That's why it's called non-random mating. And this, when we talk about non-random mating, we're talking about sexual selection. There are traits that are beneficial to survival. Oftentimes, those are not the traits that make individuals, quote, attractive to the ladies. Yeah, and so here you have this really beautiful bird of paradise. This is really attractive to predators. Actually, it's like, hey, I'm here, I'm dinner. Same thing with these nice bright colors, but it's what the females like. And so successful individuals have to balance these traits that are detrimental to survival, these attractive traits, versus the traits that make them more fit, right? And so it's a tricky kind of line that everybody walks, and that is sexual selection, non-random mating, and so you'll get pushes towards whatever it is that the ladies like. All right, and then migration. Migration can have two effects, actually. One, you can have this split, right, in a population, and it may not be a founder effect. It may actually be that the population is so large, it spreads out, and the ones at the furthest areas become isolated from the ones at the other end of the range, and so they may eventually become different species because there is genetic isolation between them. Now, migrants also can increase genetic flow among populations, and so you're constantly having the gene pools connected because you have all of these individuals that are moving back and forth between populations. These are wildebeest and these are monarch butterflies, so it's just fun pictures of migrations, but that's how it works. And humans actually do this. We migrate, we intermix globally, and so we have genetic flow among our populations. Okay, so which of the following is or are not due to random chance? Non-random mating, genetic drift, bottleneck effect, founder effect, or natural selection? Well, we know natural selection is not random, and we know non-random mating is not random, because non-random. Bottleneck effect and founder effect will result in genetic drift, okay? And so A and E are not random. B, C, and D are random. Okay, now what happens if you don't adapt, right? What happens if everybody else is adapting and you do not as a species? I'm not talking about you as an individual, but you as a species, right? This is extinction. If a species cannot adapt, it will become extinct. There is no species that is extinction proof. It does not matter how long you've been around, you will never be extinction proof because the environment is always applying pressure. And think about this. I love this quote. The rabbit runs faster than the fox because the rabbit is running for his life while the fox is only running for his dinner. That's not entirely true. The fox is also running for his life because dinner is his life. So the fox will need to run faster to catch the rabbit. The rabbit will need to run faster to outrun the fox or be more agile than the fox so it can escape. So there's always these pressures, this co-evolution of organisms, their interactions together will always push them to continue to have to adapt and work to survive. And then the environment itself changes, right? Think about the mass extinctions. All of those mass extinctions occurred because of rapid climate change, and those animals could not adapt to that, right? And so no species is extinction proof. And that brings us to the Red Queen hypothesis. And this is actually what I just said. Continuing adaptation is needed in order for a species to maintain its relative fitness amongst the systems it is co-evolving with, okay? It just means you're always still going to have to stay ahead of the ball if you want to survive, okay? Red Queen hypothesis, all right? Now, which statement about adaptation is not true? A species may become adapted to its environment in response to environmental pressures. As favored traits spread through the population, a species will become better adapted to its environment. When an environment changes or when an individuals move to a new environment, natural selection may result in adaptation to the new conditions. Sometimes this results in a new species. That is a run-on sentence. Sorry about that. Natural selection results in species perfectly adapted to the environment. A, B, and C are true. D is not true, okay? No species can ever be perfectly adapted to an environment because they're not getting what they need to be adapted. Some trait arises, it either is or is not successful. If it is successful, super duper, it persists. If it's not, it doesn't. But you don't get what you need, you work with what you have. All right, so that's it for natural selection. We'll be talking about speciation in the next class. If you have any questions about this, please let me know, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.